and then I've actually the first Godmom episode, quote unquote, from 2 weeks ago is now uploading to YouTube, and that should be up now or later today. And so
Oh,
we'll
sick.
we'll have an archive going, which is cool.
Yeah, I'll definitely subscribe to that too. Gotta add to those
Um,
numbers a little bit.
Tracker, what's up, man? You just got the loudest notification sound from why? Because Twitch has obnoxious notification sounds or something. Um, do you go by Alex?
Oh yeah.
Okay, cool. Um, I have to. We have to remember to check in on the comments. So I'm talking to Tracker.
Oh sure. Yeah, I'll probably be pretty quiet for most of this just because I'm trying to get homework done, but I want to be here too, so
Yeah, nice. I
we'll
appreciate
be
it.
half and half.
If
No
you
problem.
if you weren't me, it would just if you weren't if you weren't me. It's very deep. If you weren't here, it would just be me. For now. So
hmm
that's weird. Um, okay, Catherine's gonna join in a second.
Cool.
Yeah, tracker. Yeah, it looks like a circuit board. This is we're not necessarily talking about what's on the screen here today. I just wanted to have some Godmom content up. This is what we're looking at. This is just biz in general, trying to figure stuff out. But what I'm working on like a white paper slash deck, maybe more of a deck than a white paper that just helps communicate the structure of what we're building and some of how like the scarcity stuff could work and how the divinations work and that kind of stuff. So that's what you're looking at. This is like
Cool.
the first part of that process. It feels like you are creating an interface with the infinite. Um, yeah, it's funny because so the dots in the background here were supposed to like that. That's another version of what you're seeing here, which is this is a contract. So this looks like a scroll because it's like a legal document, which is a smart contract. So these are smart contracts. This is a wallet, and then in the middle here, this big block, that's a blockchain. This is supposed to be like on chain. This lower portion is supposed to be on chain. This is off chain. So anyway, this blockchain pattern with the dashed lines is what I was doing here, which is just that this legal contract, the smart contract, lives on the chain, and that's like everything happening on chain. Like maybe we just have this texture in the lower quadrants persistently. That could be a cool aesthetic too, but but the thing is, tracker, by way of you saying that this feels like interface with the infinite, which is also true, where I'm trying to like the reason you see these dots everywhere, they're supposed to represent the Holy Spirit or just like spirit in general, where the whole thing is just sort of permeated by truth, let's say, as everything in reality is, I think, according to our cosmology. But it's just having it kind of like a layer is sort of cheating. Like I kind of want to have like a call out to like higher self here as well. But the thing is, using this, like our grid is sort of key to what we're building, where it's come to represent this sort of game board that we're making, and then also just the sort of net aspect, or everything is sort of equal and catching, let's say, has become sort of a symbol of Godmom and our identity, and actually use that pattern on the tweet. Let me see if I have that. Do I have that here? Where did that go? Yeah, so there's like the game board, but that's not what I was looking for. How would I have... Oh, here it is. There. So this is the graphic that I used in the tweet, which was just that which is just like a colorful net, which I had taken from the diagram. I just grabbed it real quick because I wanted an image for the tweet, and I just pulled it over. So it's funny because now, by virtue of your feedback tracker, thank you, I just realized, it's the symbology. I mean, this is kind of confusing, unless I want to say the blockchain is feminine, or like the blockchain is the infinite, which might actually be fair. Um, um, but either way, that's the impression that this is giving, and that's like a blockchain as infinite is part of our language, but I hadn't made the graphic or the symbolic connection here that I was already making. Just I hadn't realized it. So that's sick, and I appreciate it because now I'm conscious of it, and I'm not sure how we'll use it. So like, yeah, here's another. So this is like, what are these called? Shit, I can never remember. Oh, right. So this is an RPC from our site interacting with a smart contract. Smart contract interacts with blockchain, which shoots, whatever. I'm sorry. I said we weren't going to talk about this. Anyway, thank you again. You now have more comments. Hold on. Blockchain domain on the lower half, right? Blockchain is like the Akashic record. Yeah, the blockchain is like the Akashic record. Totally. That's funny. And very true in a really wild way. Grid pattern, interesting. Wait, is the infinite feminine or masculine? The from I think it's like the infinite is so the infinite has aspects of both masculine and feminine. They're like an infinite duality. Again, I'm like speaking for the way that we're approaching this. I'm not necessarily speaking truth, but yeah. So infinite, both feminine and masculine are infinite. However, I think you can also say that feminine is symbolic for infinite. Is like is more symbolic of the infinite, and or yeah, it's sort of like the masculine is more like you would if you're going to use infinite as feminine, then you would use like this moment or this single action or like an instantiation. Oh God, I use that word. Like a like yeah, like the opposite of the infinite would be like a moment, and I think that's fair as like a comparative quality of feminine and masculine. So, and it's also subjective, where from our perspective, subjectively, like we are an ego, we are thinking right now, and so feminine as infinite is sort of just like to be in that you wouldn't have an ego anymore, and that makes it feminine. I don't know. I'm sort of talking too much. Yeah. Wait.
I would agree with that, though.
Oh, good.
That's making sense.
Oh, there's Catherine. Cool. Yay, I don't have to... I wonder why I didn't get a notification.
What up?
Hey, sorry about that.
Oh no, it's fine.
How long were you waiting? I was ranting. That's what happened.
Not too long, like a couple minutes.
10 minutes.
Hang on, sorry, I've got to turn off the stream. Okay. What's good?
Oh wait, I want to do the share screen. There we go. Now we got everyone's camera. Wish I could make it bigger. And then I'll turn off my... Actually, sorry about that. Anyway, how you doing, Kath?
Doing good. I've got Daniel off screen next to me, so we're sort of...
Hey, I might join at some point, but I'm working on something else. I'm caught up in something else, so I'm trying not to lose track of the conversation, but I'm not fully tuned in yet.
No worries. It'll be great to have new blood here in a little bit. As
You have a hype house scenario going on here.
as we go through different cycles. Yeah, I was just ranting about what's on the screen, and then Tracker in the comments had asked if the infinite is feminine, and then of course that sent me down like a thing.
Yeah, I think Daniel like right off jump was like, oh, like kind of just like defining this like masculine and feminine thing. I'm not sure that's necessarily something we want to do, but it's very, I think it's yeah, it's still just striking me as like tricky language. What do
Yeah,
you
I
want to say,
mean,
Daniel?
like, I like the way that Lacan responds to Freud's understanding of masculine and feminine, like the way that Lacan develops like the phallus in Freud. He uses it just as like an object in language, but it has nothing to do with any sort of biological anything. Well, it has to do with like real people, like biology in that sense, but it's not tied to um, like you can never know whether you're masculine or feminine.
Mm.
For Lacan, they're
Mm.
they're just like relational concepts out there, but they have nothing to do with like a specific person. They're structures. They're impersonal things.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like the way that it's been coming up here, like on the Discord or whatever. But it's, I guess I'm sort of just like, what about like the presentation here was giving you the impression that it wasn't impersonal?
Um, the fact that it wasn't explained very well, and just kind of the impression that I got from last time that you talked about it, like it seems like the things that you associate with masculine and feminine tend to be, I don't like more traditional notions of masculinity and femininity. Like for Lacan, I'm gonna mess this up, but I think he says like the feminine is like the rejection of the not all set. Like that's has nothing to do with the way that you talk about masculine and feminine in regular culture. They're like more like they're mathemes. They're like almost mathematical relations.
I mean, I would say that's definitely the way in which it's going down here. But I'm more just like, wow, like, I don't know. I'm picking up on that when it's being put down, but
I just tuned in for a second. I didn't hear the specifics, but I remember from some other conversations that I've heard around, I don't know, just in the spiritual community, not necessarily you particularly, but yeah, because I'm not so involved in this yet. But that's the impression I get.
so what do you think about the question that's just like, is the feminine infinite?
Yeah, you need to explain what you mean by feminine there. It's not a definition of feminine, but it's like that's kind of a meaningless question unless people are clear about what's being discussed, I think.
I don't know, these seem like sort of like contextualizing, like, when we talk about this stuff, from where do we start?
Yeah, I'm just jumping in. So, as someone who's just an interlocutor in here, it's a little, it's not the most accessible language, I guess, I would say.
Very interesting. Thank you for all of this. Yeah, like I think you guys kind of got to like a little bit of a full circle there towards the end, which is where I'm at, which is like I think this is a conversation we're going to keep having like many times over because it is sensitive and interesting and intricate and topical. It's like it has a lot of skin in the game from a lot of people and a lot of perspectives, and I think we have been. I think what a lot of what's being noted right now is a lack of content and explanation up front about our terms and what we mean. And I think it's like it's like very accurate to say that we don't have that yet, and that we are potentially like communicating in ways that we don't necessarily pick up on, because like a lot of us have been talking about this for a while, so I know that we know each other's baseline. And yeah, like explaining masculine, feminine, what we mean by it, what we're referencing historically, like ideally would be like, who do we sound like, who do we not sound like, potentially. Yeah, so all of that with and I said all of that without even getting into the topic, but I guess that's a lot of what I hear. Listening to you both, it's sort of like I very much agree with Kath that I don't really hear a conflict. Like I think we're on the same level. My understanding of Lacan, Freud, etc., is that these concepts are extremely compatible, and yeah, I mean, I don't doubt that I've used language that like felt more traditional, partly because this language does extend into traditional concepts as well, where like to talk about masculine, it would be hard to get away from something like I think it would be hard to get away from something like talking about action or activity, like
Why?
movement. Well, let's say that my understanding of the references that people have made to masculine over time, all of them include qualities of action. Let's say, at a base level, at like maybe like a priors level. If we're gonna talk about like a phallus, you would think about a dick drives action, like it makes you want to act. If you start at base primitives and like feelings, because when I think about these symbols, it's going to come back to like
Well, for like Freud and Lacan, no one has a phallus. Everyone's castrated. So they're really flipping these traditional notions over on their head, I think, in a way that it seems like the way you're describing it, I don't get that impression. Like the fact that you were saying this is how people in society, traditional people, would ever talk about masculinity as related to action, I think is kind of missing out on a lot of other like feminist discourses that have worked to think more critically about like what is action and why some people associate it like that, but it's really not like a totalizing. Yeah.
But I think it's more just like I think that there's the level of abstraction. Like, can we agree on just a sort of like there's a level of abstracting happening here that it's like even if like everyone's if we're gonna get into the Freudian thing, like even if everyone's castrated, that like I mean I think that it's almost like that it feels like the fundamental problem here is that it's like can you as a theorist like handle the kind of like archetypal concepts like the sort of like the concept of polarity basically, in which there's sort of things that are grouped under two general poles and that have like
Well, it seems like there's a lot of interrelation between the poles. If you're saying,
of course, because they're they're interacting with each other to kind of like create and uncreate, like it's I don't know.
well, why would you
It's-
call it
it's ba-
masculine
I mean,
and
it's-
feminine, or
It's base primitives.
why do you use those terms?
well, so what I was where I had started to go, which I think I'll keep going because I think it answers the question you just asked, which was the base primitives that we're working from, as far as I understand it, are like prehistorical base primitives. So we're trying to work with things like day and night, the seasons, the relationships between the seasons, the relationships between things like day and night, the cardinal.
These things are I mean, they're rendered
I'm
as prehistorical, but like seasons aren't
the cardinal directions. I mean, I shared a spreadsheet that makes the correlations, and maybe I'll point out like because I think what I heard the exchange between you and Catherine that just happened was like, yes, there's polarities, but yes, also the relationship between those polarities is key and like exquisite. And then on top of that, it becomes like, why do those polarities need to be called, or why are we calling them masculine and feminine at all? So included with things like seasons and day and night and the other base primitives, you have things like man and woman and having a child and extending the family and like fucking and having sex. Like those are really primitive aspects included with, I think we can say, like the stars and the sun and the moon, your children. You know, it's like these are really basic things. And I think when you're looking at things like day and night, which becomes symbolic of things like mystery and truth, being able to see versus not being able to see, things being hidden, pregnancy, the correlations become really interesting and beautiful over time. And as far as the spectrum between them goes, that's how it works out so well. As far as I understand it, what winds up happening in like the cosmology is that you have this base duality of nothingness and somethingness, but then it is through the interchange of those two as they communicate with each other that you get the gray. You know, as white as 99% white gets 1% black and vice versa, you get all of the different shades in between. And as you're looking at the screen, so what we have here is like two columns of duality, and there's two reasons I wanted to bring this up. One is like, if you wanted to scroll through this, it'd be really interesting to hear what you had to say, and also it may answer some questions, which is there's these two dualities, and towards the bottom they start to extend into more modern thinkers. I don't think I have Lacan in here, but there is some interesting stuff. The correlations may or may not work. I think they do. But then also, wait, hold on. Wait.
I'll let you let me know when it's time to talk.
I'm almost done, which is just, okay, so there's the two polarities. The two polarities symbolically, archetypically can be described as the summer and the winter. So you have like the full power of the heat, you have the full power of summer, and then you have the full death of the winter. Like if you're getting, and those become corollaries with, I'm sorry to use it, but let's just say they're corollaries with masculine and feminine, which are also corollaries with inside, outside, plus and minus, etc. Since I said summer and winter, that implies spring and fall. And when you have the base level of the polarities interact with each other, you have these four archetypal patterns, and the four become really identifiable and interesting. And I only wanted to bring this up as like, this is already gray area, where like you're already into four, you're already into not two, and these four are found as patterns in like everything. You also have the Trinity, and then it just goes up numerically from there, and then you start whatever. I'll leave it at that. But yes, of course, the relationship between the two is the entire game. It's definitely not about splitting things into two different groups and leaving it at that. And we can also talk about like why masculine and feminine, but I already said a lot, and I'll leave it at that. And I apologize for cutting you off, but that's it.
Okay, I guess if one way that I could imagine reading this chart, or one way I see it being read, is that there are like two columns that are next to each other, positive, negative, inside, outside, air, water, what is it, air, fire, water, earth, cardinal, fixed, dual.
Sorry, I'm not sure where you want to look. Are you at the four or the two?
I'm looking across at this, what's number 3, like row, is that row? Yeah, row 3 across the whole way. The biggest box on the screen. Do you see what I'm looking at? How do I highlight it? Like all of these ones, can you see that I have them selected?
Doesn't seem like it. For some reason, seems like your cursor would be in
It's a
there.
row that has positive, negative, inside, outside, air, fire. Do you see that whole row?
Mm-hmm. The big one.
Yeah, exactly. Why do you need anything below that? Like, could you read it as just, these are the relations that we're talking about structurally? What's added by elaborating all these others? Are those synonyms, basically? Why do you need to repeat it so many times? Is it just repetition, I guess? Or is there something being added?
I think this is like how archetypes work, which is like they're energy patterns that you find in everything, to different percentages. So in this case, like the way I think of it is like air, fire, water, earth are like these energy patterns that you find in everything. And in some things, it's easier to tell what they split across. So this is essentially like a dimensional cut, a cut across dimensions where we can look at different things and then see how they split into these four. And like one thing that goes here is like experience, which is like I could just call this a person. So like a person has air, fire, water, earth elements. But we don't call them that necessarily because it's not as useful to call everything air, fire, water, earth. In our case, we call them mind, spirit, emotion, or feelings and body. Whether or not you want to cut yourself into those four parts and think of yourself in those four ways, it is like there is cool precedent within historical literature for how this is the way the ancients were doing it, and these were the symbols they were using. And so when they're talking about air, like you've probably done tarot, like they're not talking about air, they're talking about symbols. They're talking about things that are particular to yourself. And like this is how you like knowing these types of relationships is like how you would read a tarot deck, for instance. It would be like, well, it's like the sun, but that can also mean it's the summer, or that can also mean it's the whatever. Like the symbol, like depending on where like a query or a querent might appear, where it's like, hey, should I get a new job or should I move next month? You want to know where the archetype appears in that slice of, or how that archetype looks in that slice of reality, I guess. Sorry, my language sucks, but that's why the list gets so deep. I mean, in reality, this like there should be as many rows as there are definitions, I guess, or objects.
So it's like maybe a way of decoding. If you see fire, it means summer. If you see masculine, it means noon, depending on how you want to read it. Or like these are different ways of
yes,
they're codes for each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then and then it starts to get interesting when you start to stack them on top of each other, because things aren't that simple. Like this is the gradient between the polarities, because you don't just have a beginning and you don't just have an end. You have things like the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning of the end. You have things like the feeling of my mind, or you have things like the beginning of the feeling of my mind in my body. Like the life is very complex, and we have like the notion, like the cool thing about this is that most of it reduces down to story. I think I have one here for story, which is just like the four cycles. It's beginning, middle, I'm sorry. Oh, that's because I have it this way. But it's beginning, middle, end, and then new to start the cycle over again. And basically everything in existence, because we're all subject to time, maybe, has that. And so it can be really useful to just be like, as a reminder, like everything has these four elements, and those four elements are also just your state in the process. Air is the beginning, summer is the middle, fall is the end, and winter is death or change or new. The opportunity for something new, for spring to begin again. And again, like those patterns can apply to like your project, to whatever, and then you can start nesting them within each other. So it's like, yeah, like Zeus has feminine qualities, like for sure, and you can extract them through this kind of process.
I guess I see kind of a tension between using these as like symbolic structures and using them to refer to things outside of pure symbols. And that's like, because in the real world outside of symbols, like there's the way that masculine and feminine relate is very, very, very different from the way that like summer and whatever you have as the opposite of summer, winter. Like if we're talking about those as real things, they're different. If you want to talk about them in language as symbols, you can say they're the same and you can flesh that out. But if like that's the difference between like empirical research and like I don't know, structural or theoretical or metaphysics or something like that.
No,
Yeah.
very interesting.
Well, I think the question here is sort of like the meta question that's coming up for me is like, what's the what are the risks and challenges of communicating a symbolic language, and just kind of like prefacing or foregrounding with like this is a metaphysical thing. This is about metaphysics and language to some extent. Like, what is that as as we are in some ways interested in transmuting, or what's the word I'm looking for? Transmitting this.
Transmuting was good.
Like, what's the what are the things that we need to know about it? And I think a lot of like where Danielle's coming from is like I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm surely am, but like the challenges of like a position that's finding, I don't know, very critical of archetypes.
Yeah, like I can't imagine ever, going out one day and it's, a hot summer morning and I would say it's a really masculine day today. Like, it, I don't think is that what you're getting at? Would you draw a connection like that? Because that's really not at all how I think, and I see a lot of problems with the way that like the typical immediate association of like some inequality with masculinity in relation to like real things that you would say are masculine rather than just symbolic things that you can say are masculine might be like,
and I guess
problematic.
Well, like as a means to sort of introduce some of what we were talking about in the above channel on the Discord around just like what is Western Hermeticism kind of lacking, what's really available to us through like Buddhism and other sort of Eastern situations. And it would kind of want to add a big like pin on the strange fruits of colonization and globalization. But yeah, kind of like, so I guess only to bring that up to say like one of the ways that I found to get around it is to have like a very differently paired association cloud with that word used. So instead of, I very rarely use masculine and feminine specifically when I'm talking about this stuff, just because in my circles or whatever, like it can be hard to just be like, I'm talking about the archetypal feminine. I often just say yin. Or because it's like something about that, I don't know, like
Well, if you're gonna,
globalized
yeah,
like
if you're gonna talk
slew.
about it, you need to, I think, preface it by saying like, these are just words. They're not about anything beyond language. They're like, codes. I could be saying 1, 2, 3, 4.
Well, and in this case, we literally are saying 1, 2, 3, 4
Then why do
in
you
some
put all these?
ways.
I mean, then the fact that you're ascribing these other things onto them seems worth interrogating further. Like, what makes two a man or something like that?
I mean, and two is, and the thing is, two is like feminine. You know,
Okay.
like that's like the
the
numerology.
fact that I didn't know how to do that, I think
Yeah.
maybe is
the numerology
reason
of two.
to like
Yeah.
think more about
I
how
think it's like,
intuitive or how like base or whatever you said these connections really are.
I think the reason
Go ahead,
is, I think the reason we can't avoid masculine feminine isn't because I have some, just for like Daniel, you don't know me, like, and people that are watching this maybe don't know me.
Yeah.
I'm not saying to avoid it. I agree with that.
No, I know you're not, and I'm saying like I can see how it would be like this whole thing might would be slightly sus, like, especially given, well, whatever. I won't even get into it, but like, so I think the reasons for keeping masculine and feminine around are pure and good and true, and so I'm going to keep at it. And the reason I think that those qualities are accurate is because one of the goals with this project is to I haven't it's let's say it's something like simulating a classical education, which is another way of saying just like reverse going through the process that I've gone through that I've really enjoyed over the last handful of years, which is another way of saying masculine and feminine and understanding what they meant to people in the past allows you to read ancient literature as a great romance novel between the self and God or something like that. And it's
Sort of concept of like the word, right?
well, more directly, I mean it's like the Gospel of
Like,
Thomas has all of this like the Gospel of Thomas is highly problematic, like with a capital P. And it like the whole thing's about masculine, feminine, like it's literally like the feminine or like women cannot enter the kingdom of God or something like that because the language is like deeply encoded and what it's saying I mean it would take I could explain it, but the reason it works and the reason it's not just that this guy was a piece of shit is that they're speaking symbolically and what they're talking about is a holy marriage between man and woman that is the soul and the spirit. Like this is language that whether you approve of it now or not, if you know it, you get to read things in a different way that gives you knowledge that helps you grow and learn and become spiritual in a way that I think is worth becoming and what I'm trying to help achieve. So it's really like it's not so much that I like masculine and feminine. I don't like saying it. I don't like whatever. It's really more about it is part of the heritage and understanding its place in it. I think does unlock both historical information and current information. I mean, like I think with Catherine, I'm very much the same as Catherine in the sense of I put these things in I think in a different cloud in my mind. When I hear someone else say masculine and feminine, when I see it in anywhere else in popular culture or even in day-to-day life, I'm not thinking in these terms. It's sort of a like living symbolically, symbolic language are intentional and interesting, difficult activities, and they require like yeah intention and thought. Yeah.
Well, the
So,
reason that like uh, post-structuralist psychoanalytics and schizoanalysis that invented so many words is because they were reading old texts. Like Lacan was like reading and referencing the Bible and like
nice.
the old like, plays and whatever.
like the
Um,
like the Greco like Greek
yeah,
myths
like
and
stuff from thousands of years ago and reckoning with the symbols there, and then coming up with new words and math themes and stuff that had nothing to do with the words that they were using in history or the words that were available in the present.
Mm.
Coming up with a story that would make these new words meaningful in context and grounded in that particular lineage, but without the baggage of other histories that he wasn't talking about. Like if you like Lacan talked about the phallus and used that as a way to move away from using that language. He would talk about it in relation to Freud, and then he would talk about like object petit or whatever when he was talking about it in his math themes.
yeah, I mean the reason I think that this type of thought hole has been interesting and like fruitful for me, at least engaging with Daniel in our house for the past 2 years has been because there's like a weird resonance that it has with me. Like I think about particularly like just some of the things that I've been exposed through Advaita Vedanta, but just the way that it's kind of talking about it's the Western tradition that is like talking about language itself, and so much of what like us in the kind of like uh, mm, spiritual sector, I guess, or like I don't even
Light workers.
light workers, or I don't know. I mean, even just like the kind of magical revival space, like what
That's
we
sick.
also through like I think about just like Terrence McKenna and what he's talking about language, where it's like it's coming from a very different zone, um, or even talking about like how the Bible is using language and being language, thinking about the word as a concept, like this type of post-structuralism is dealing with that through I don't know this like Western intellectual tradition. Like it's still the same sort of
Mm.
to me. I mean, to kind of try to knit those languages together a bit. Like it to me, it feels like very much magical, like uh, magical language analysis. The way that magic uses language as well.
Yeah, this idea of, I don't know, like going back to like base primitives, I think was that the term you used, or like this holy truth or something like that, seems pretty out of time to me. Like it doesn't at all feel like it works in the world that I live in today. Um, like every time I use the word masculine, it might mean something different. Um, and every word is always like that when everyone uses any word. It always refers to the context in which it's used, the sentences and the places and the bodies and whatever. And being able to like put all those symbols in context is what gives meaning to the entirety of language in that particular like instance. So yeah, when I don't know, I try to like communicate to the people that I'm around, to the audience. I think that's pretty important, and maybe I'm just like not the audience. Maybe I shouldn't be here, or maybe like I don't know. I get that this is like a learning process too. I'm learning and you're learning, but uh, yeah, in some ways, this I'm hesitant to just like go along with you without holding my own reservations about this language. Um,
I think that's. I mean, I think that's good. I also I guess I'm curious. Like, what's the like um, you do this type of analysis and you see a value in doing it.
yeah.
Um, it to recontextualize it in like weird magic language is your practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's like yeah, I guess it's sort of like I'm curious to kind of like about the communication between practitioners and non-practitioners.
I don't need to talk about my practice to to people who aren't engaging with the discourse in the same way that I am, unless I'm going through and picking out particular stories and not telling them faithfully and telling them wrong to communicate something. Like that's what uh, yeah, if someone was like checking me and being like, where are your sources on this, I would have to tell the story differently. But in the interest of like reaching people and communicating effectively, it means like every retelling is a different telling, and I've through my practice I've learned certain things that I'm able to translate like this, but um, yeah, it's
What
I'm more interested in the way that this practice helps me like engage in the world in a meaningful way that is like uh, picking up the stories that are compelling to me and being able to share them with other people. I think that's a big part of like reading theory. Um,
Wait, can you give an example of like some of that type of sharing and what that kind of like wrong telling?
like if you're if you're in the academy and you're writing an article for peer review or that sort of thing, like you need to have footnotes and citations, and you're expecting someone to go through and read the same things you read, and you're supposed to tell them where to look, and they're supposed to be able to extrapolate from the same sources to fill in together and follow along with your story, and be able to call you out if you're um, doing something that's like inconsistent with what you claim to be doing with the text and the way that you're forming an argument, and bringing up other counter arguments that other people have made.
But yeah, let's say you're not in an academic context and like you're doing some of this like synthesizing of like living in the world or whatever.
Yeah, then I just kind of try not to talk too much about the different ways that Marx uses the word fetish throughout with chapter 2 of Capital, which is interesting to me, but the way that I learned to recognize commodity fetishism, or just people interacting with objects as if they were the or I mean, even this is getting more into the nitty-gritty of the text than I need to do to communicate with people. Like, very often these things just don't come up, and I would rather ask them questions about what's meaningful to them, and try to meet them that way.
It reminds me of like we've kind of had a theme of this question before in the Discord and elsewhere about like almost like what's the point of esoteric language? What is esotericism?
I can tell you what I think it is. What do you think it is?
Well, let's hear. What do you think it is, Ben?
No, I want to hear Daniel's answer.
Okay. What do you think it is, Daniel?
Like a form of community building that requires a lot of work on the parts of the people who will participate, and a way of keeping out certain people. Like by using an accessible language, you create a community of people who get the language and people who don't.
Right.
And that can be
There's
really
like
useful.
An inherent miscommunication. So what would the useful? Like, in what ways is it useful?
If you want to filter out the noise, so you don't end up with Twitter, where everyone's saying literal shit and listening to each other's shit and reposting it and commenting on it, and it can very easily seem like a bad faith misinterpretation when it's just a matter of the wrong audience, and it's a structural problem. It's not this person didn't do the work of reading everything I've ever tweeted and reading the same sources I read. That's totally unreasonable to expect people to go through this onboarding process or education process to get this same language that someone is using when they're it's yeah, I mean, it's about knowing your audience, I think.
I think about esotericism as it does have this kind of inherent relationship to audience and audiences, but also I guess the way the kind of specificity. I mean, I think in the context that we've talked about it, it's been more about why, this sort of why is the Gospel of Thomas coded? Why did I have to kind of basically go through the trouble of learning Sanskrit to get to get some shit out of Advaita Vedanta, even though these concepts exist through certain there's kind of a garden path. I mean, I think I took a type of way into it that was requiring that specificity, but I also appreciate people like Ram Dass who talk about that shit and don't, or I don't know, have a wider audience. It doesn't necessarily require learning Sanskrit in order to understand Advaita Vedanta, to understand a certain type of wisdom tradition. But it's also kind of like a fusion. It's not, then it becomes I think like thinking about this sort of Eastern Western esotericism, it's like it's becoming less. It becomes Western esotericism again through just the kind of like story of that person going east and coming west and having largely Western audiences. um, for Eastern concepts or things that he learned in this context. So I guess like it's sort of, I don't know, the question of like why do these yogis like live up in the mountain, like why are there always kind of secluded communities associated with mysticism and certain types of and esotericism. Why did in Western like natural magic is that all just like highly encoded? And there's this kind of like, I mean, even to bring it back to the Bible, like all who have ears to hear should hear. Like, what does that mean in relation to esotericism? So, yeah, I mean, it's I don't know, it's like kind of like, and I think this also what Jesus talks about through like the way, like where it's like, why is the figure of Jesus important? Well, it's like if what he's sort of, he's talking about a sort of like threshing ground, he's talking about a sort of separation and like entering into a body of knowledge, let's say, because Jesus is communicating through the word. Like it's not like, if there's a way into that body of knowledge that might just be like someone living in the woods forever. But like Jesus is a teacher and a talker, and the words are written down, and that's the way. That's like the anyway. But yeah, what is that like? Yeah, I think that I'm curious about what that means about how we communicate.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that the type of, I guess, I mean, it feels worth noting that this whole, the whole context here is this was hidden information that we're trying to make less hidden. And so concerns about it being, needing a lot of preamble to understand it, or to not to understand it necessarily, but to accept it in the way that it's intended to be understood, is certainly like part of this, and it's risky and tricky and maybe foolish, hopefully not, to just sort of like try and blow the lid off of what has been an esoteric tradition for millennia, and it's like part of what's crazy is that all of these esoteric traditions seem to follow the same pattern, and that's kind
No, they
of
don't.
all of these.
I mean, like, what pattern are you referring to? It seems like you're kind of erasing a lot of difference between these different cultures. I struggle with the idea that two things are following the same pattern without. I mean, you haven't done anything to show that. You've kind of said like, if you look at these, I made this chart. You can see it, but like, I don't find that very compelling, and I can see a lot of other ways of reading these things differently.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've already talked about how a large part of the conversation here is a lack of material. So fair. I'm not an academic. I don't really have any interest in approaching this as an academic. I think, yeah, I mean, I have a lot of opinions on that, but I think we'll do as good of a job as we can to justify the symbols that we're using before we invite people to use them, and I think it'll be really interesting because, like it or not, they'll be able to spot these patterns throughout literature and art and history and everything. And they'll also, I think, anyone engaged in this conversation, internally or externally, I think will also be able to keep their definitions to themselves. You know, this isn't, there's no authority here. Strictly voluntary. You know, it's like if someone.
I thought that.
What's up?
I think that the way that you're in kind of pairing together or mix, consider maybe that you might be like conflating like uh, accessibility and like dogma or something like that. Like the idea that people will learn something when they follow this protocol is hard for me to get on board with. Like, I feel like if you want something to be accessible, you need to recognize the way that you're not teaching anyone anything. You're rather than like changing the way they think or act or anything, you're just giving them new words to do the same thing they always do. But if you want to impose your culture on someone, then you need to actually create something esoteric. And these terms that you've presented here are not esoteric. They're very accessible. If you have all these synonyms, you don't need to do the work of figuring out what these relationships are. You can just say, oh, I know what masculine is intuitively without thinking any more about it, and you don't learn anything in that process. Like, if you come up with new terms that force people to investigate what they mean, and then you can, through that level of like the process of forcing someone to learn something new, that's how you can change culture through like the process of acquiring esoteric knowledge. But what you've presented here doesn't do that. Instead, it's like a way of creating a community through bringing people together who maybe have very little in common.
Interesting. Would the
Yeah.
well, I just want to the language thing is very interesting and I appreciate it. I'm curious. Does the like I would say that I disagree in as much as I really appreciate the insight and I want to take it to heart. And then I also want to say that as I'm taking it to heart, I disagree because it does feel as though we're developing a new language, and the new language is the binary, which is what we're literally, ironically, maybe, we're literally looking at it right now, which is that through the system, through the interface, through the brand, we're going to be teaching people a set of polarities, a set of ways to read binary, essentially. So we're going to be grouping previous thoughts into new packages. And those packages are going to be our own. And if you want to understand our binary, if you want to understand our combinations of polarities, you have to do some work. So I guess I'm just interested. Like, do you feel like we start to approach? Because it sounds like you're saying, if I can try and summarize what you're saying, or part of what you're saying, I can't encompass all of it, of course, but part of what you're saying, or part of what I'm hearing, is that if you don't use new language, you run the risk of almost running or inferring like almost like a populist course, where you want to control people's thoughts with language they already use, or it's like you're not. Yeah, I mean, I'll leave it. Maybe I'll leave it there. And if you actually, and it goes both ways, because if you're using language people already use, then you're not really encouraging any kind of new behavior, because they will by default use the understandings that they already have, because they already have associations with these words. And so it is, and so therefore, if I'm understanding you, it is through the creation of new terminology, new summaries, and hopefully like additions of thought, combinations with new additions of thought, and then new language, that you are then able to affect behavior, because you have to like insert new patterns through with like a new package, essentially. And it's more responsible to create new language for the reasons I tried to cover, which is like it's less like mind mind fuckery, and it's also more encouraging of like a healthy relationship with like language maybe. And so if I get like A, did I get that right at all, and then B, like with the binary question, do you feel like we're starting to approach that? Does it seem valid at all?
I think you're almost getting what you're very close to getting, or you're getting a lot of what I'm saying. Thanks for listening. I appreciate that.
Well,
Um,
thanks for writing it.
the the thing that I'm not saying you always use this phrase new language, which makes me think that you're focusing on the way that I use that. But when I say new language, I don't mean you need to invent a totally new
Mm-hmm.
word.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to this example that I've been using throughout our conversation today of the way that Freud and Lacan talk about masculine and feminine, I would say that for them, masculine and feminine is new language. Even though the terms are familiar, they use them in a not in a consistent way, actually. They change it, but they're very clear about the way that they're changing what they mean. And they stick to it. They don't just say
I see.
masculine is the same as mind, is the same as morning, is this,
I see.
because that, um,
If I
yeah,
could,
like,
is maybe the thing I'm not getting yet something to the effect of like I seem to be making a claim, and therefore the system seems to be making a claim that we don't need to we don't need to define our terms because we're using terms that are everywhere, and we're using patterns that are everywhere, and all you have to do is like understand this stuff and then you'll get the system, or something to that effect. It's like
yeah,
we're making the claim that all language across time is equal, and that's clearly not the case. Is it something more like that? Like we're not establishing terms, and therefore it's
yeah,
okay.
I think that's right. Is that what you want to do? Is that your point?
I'm sorry. The question is, do I want to be doing more of what you think we need to be doing?
No,
And
do you want to be doing more?
I didn't mean to frame it.
Yeah,
That was. I'm sorry.
yeah,
That I apologize. That was a clumsy way to frame it. Do we need to be doing? Do we need to define our terms, and do I want to be doing that more so? Is that was that the question?
like, are you purposefully not doing that in order to create this illusion that there's consistency
I
across
see.
time and
I
language
see.
is always the same and that sort of
I
thing?
see. Sure. I think I'm insensitive to the problem to start, and so I haven't. It hasn't been my concern, let's say, because I've assumed that towards the end, when these things made sense, we would be able to work backwards into definitions and context and explanation. I think that part of my interest, or like a large part of my interest, is like I don't curious to like the philosophies that we're interested in, the philosophies that seem to contain a lot of useful, beautiful truth, when these things were written, did not have the same rules of association or language or social considerations that we have now. And I might say that there was more consistency between how they use language I don't know, I don't want to say that. I don't know enough. I don't want to say that. But I do want to the system only works if I'm making the claim that esoteric traditions are using these terms consistently over time. It's not making the claim that everyone has been using it over time. It's making the claim that people who have been writing and working within a certain framework of wisdom, let's say, have been using the same symbols, or symbols that have been close enough that we can make them approximations to each other. But maybe the last thought there, making that clear is part of the work, and so framing and defining our terms is part of the work, and we will it just sounds like I don't know if the definition or the way that we're defining them will be its own form of being problematic or like be its own way of have its own inconsistencies. But
I don't
yeah,
think
within what's up?
I was gonna say, I don't think it's the definitions that you're gonna come up with that are the problem. I think it's actually this idea that there's consistency throughout history. I think that's the really dangerous part. at least coming from, my background where like have been studying historical materialism, it's usually the people that are not paying attention to historical context and create this illusion of like ahistoricity or like this continuous trans-historical present are usually the fascist ones. And that's,
The fascist
yeah,
ones. Wow.
yeah. Like if you read, who is it? I want to say like Schulte Sasa on Heidegger's use of language, or I mean, there are lots of people that talk about it's the Frankfurt School thing too, even though Heidegger was kind of after that. And he's a really good example because he's very clearly a Nazi.
Like literally.
Yeah, like literally. So he's a good example of someone who uses like a historical, who uses language specifically. I mean, this is the Frankfurt School critique, or post-Frankfurt or whatever school critique of Heidegger, is the way that he plays language games and substitutes different terms without their historical context to create this illusion of transhistoricity. And yeah, and he's a fascist. Like that's very specifically one of the issues with him. So it's something that I kind of alert to is like being inconsistent with terms to create a transhistorical big truth that yeah, takes advantage of people.
And I relate this really to the way in which a lot of organized religions, but I'm going to use Christianity specifically because that's the one. Like, how do the teachings of Christ get used for so much abuse? That type of thing. Like it feels like I don't know, maybe I'm leaping too far here, but the way in which, like, because I do see that in the way that Christianity has been interpreted to cause harm has had a lot to do with like these are the like an understanding of spirit that is, I don't know, just sort of saying these are the laws of God. This is because it's like, when we talk about like absolute knowledge, there is a sort of, by recognizing it as truth, like we do sort of in a way separate it from history, but it's never uncontextualized. Like it's like we can talk about truth as a concept, but it somehow loses like it becomes harmful. I almost think about like the being hungry. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Can I have some too? Thank you. Okay, cool. But even just thinking about how like the creation, like the Genesis creation myth, like what is this sort of like, we have a type of reading that's like about, I don't know. We have a type of reading about the creation story that's like, okay, it's kind of like a plant to like demonize Eve and create a justification for why women are treated badly. I mean, that's a bit of a flattening there, but also there's the idea embedded in it as well, in the sort of like trad or like straight reading that's like, what's the danger of the knowledge? Like what's the, like why is this fruit from the tree of knowledge forbidden? Which I think is also an interesting reading.
I only caught the end of that. Were you saying that the sort of big truth that I would associate with fascism is the forbidden knowledge, and asking why?
I guess like the big truth which you're associating with fascism is it's like there's like there is a complex, very difficult to find truth that is I would assume why you do what you do in terms of like your knowledge finding. Or like, I mean, the problem is it's like it's almost like a not truth, like a, you know, it's like a by eliminating, like I think about the I don't know, like the Nisargadatta Maharaj, like it's not that, like everything, you know, in order to find what's eternal as a self, like recognizing like self, it just becomes a question of eliminating everything that's not the self.
Spinoza says, truth is the standard for both itself and the false, meaning that you can have true when like you've got two things in accordance with each other as in a relation. They're true. False, you need to have a truth. There's a truth implied in the false. It's like both of these things are constructed through relation is the point, and
Right.
there is no truth.
Right, and the kind of like
except in context.
Right, and the sort of like fascist truth is one in which the relation is eliminated.
No.
Okay. Yeah, I guess to kind of bring it back a bit, like what that might mean for us. Like,
how do we avoid being spiritual fascists?
yeah, because it's the same thing I'm interested in Christianity. It's the same thing I'm interested in New Age and cults and all that shit. Like it's, you know, it's like what's the, I don't know, the kind of like what to watch out for, or what's the path and what's not the path. And I think for me the answer just lies in what the traditions tell us and like what the Bible tells us, which is like what the church is. It's a community of believers, and like these are people who had ears to hear, and it to me points to the, I mean, I think what you and I have been specifically, like our like karmic situation here has a lot to do with like dealing with evangelism.
I was gonna say, it sounds like a problem with evangelism.
Exactly. Like it's I think it's really, and I think that one of the reasons we're doing this project and like what attracts us to this project and what's kind of made it, you know, real, has to do with how, yeah, I don't know, kind of how we are positioned, how we like our kind of almost specific spiritual challenges to like de-evangelize while still understanding what that kernel, like why our spiritual like forebears in our kind of like historical in the body situation ended up there with the best of intentions. You know, it's like they're reading the same Bible.
Yeah, since I've brought up Marxism already, I would say as a Marxist, something that makes me still say I'm a Marxist, I'm a communist, well, I would say, like, if you look at the history of, you know, communist Soviet Union, they were fascists, at points in time, whatever, is like, I try not to go around saying, like, you need to read Marx, you need to believe this. Instead, I recognize the way that, like, because what they said is true, regardless of whether someone knows it or not, people have their own, like, the ability in themselves to recognize that they're being exploited and that they can change that.
And I equate that to this sort of
and
like,
I don't try to say you need to read these texts the way that, you know, like Soviet re-education camps did that and tortured people. Whereas, like, you know, today we don't torture people. Instead, we just like take their money or whatever, withhold that from them.
yeah, I mean, I relate that to like this Quaker thing of that the light is in everyone. And it's a sort of like, it's kind of what's making, to me, it's that aspect that's making that group like non-evangelical. Like it's that aspect of the theology that allows everyone to come to, like that there's no exclusion in that community, but there's also no there's the outreach is, there's not really outreach in that sense. The outreach, whatever outreach there is coming through kind of like social action, basically. Like it's while at the same time, like, the door is open. So I think like my question is kind of like, in the nature of doing this digitally, like what, like, and also, I mean, I think both just like creating the kind of like corpus of like shared knowledge between us, or at least like, what one of the things that we're kind of doing together is a type of like knowledge production, but also like how are we, I don't know, how are we just like signaling and communicating about that, again, understanding that it's like spirit that's moving. Like anyone who comes through is like, I don't know, like on the current of spirit, I suppose.
Well, this would be my advice, I guess. Like, I think uh, Marxism as like a theory or belief system or whatever is separate from the practice of communism, and like labor organizing. Um, for some people, Marxism, for people like me, it's helpful to read through these texts and learn that way how to, um, yeah, how to like see, understand history and help me figure out a way to act today and what projects I want to work on and who I want to work with or whatever. But the practice of, forming a union or, like, yeah, doing political organizing, um, doesn't need to evangelize, really. Like, there's raising awareness through creating a spectacle, through creating like a news event or something like that. But you, like,
I mean, there's also ways in which the organizations are public, like in which there's like, I mean, whatever, just there's a name for it. It has an office, there's a person you contact. What is that whole, like, I mean, putting a little like designer.
Black Lives Matter. Here's who you read your letter to.
Well, I mean, or even just like, you want to join. I was reading this article about the like whatever typesetters union in the 70s or something in New York, and it was like, that's an organization with people in it that you meet.
Yeah.
I mean, you meet them through work.
Yeah.
Like that's in that case, that's labor organizing, and that's the context. But there is a type of interfacing that's happening. It's just not an evangelical one. And I'm like, what does that, as a designer, like, what does that look like in this context? What does that look like digitally? But also just like, both from the kind of like vibe, but also like the way it's interacting, like the way that it's relating, because digitally these are like all very, they're kind of considered in a way in which, like, we're not working in the same office, like we're not we're not like going to the same grocery store in the same neighborhood or whatever. Like there's not really, and I also think about just kind of thinking again about like what the fuck church is, and like the way in which that's kind of, I don't know, like there's a relationship between the church and the community.
Yeah, I think that's exactly why I don't like designers. Is like I don't need to change the circumstances around creating opportunities for more people to get involved in my project or get on board with my idea. Like,
I mean, I think that there's a design that exists outside of that context. It probably needs a different name, but it's just that sort of like, what are we called? You know, maybe it's a very obvious name, like, you know, whatever, local 9 chapter of the typesetters union.
sure.
Like, you know, or in the case of a Quaker meeting, like Strawberry Friends, yeah, meeting.
Like the
Strawberry Creek.
in like conflict and disagreement is really important in the types. I mean, this is the way that a lot of contemporary Marxist theory talks about the relationship between like organizing and having a party, or the reason that there is no party on the left today, but there is on the right, is the way that these different groups kind of handle conflict today. The right's really good at creating disagreement and working together towards a common goal, and the left is much more purity obsessed and doesn't very often want to work with people who hold different views from them on certain things, or have a hard time with that. It's like, yeah, I mean, that's why solidarity is important. You don't need to have the same beliefs as someone if you're working towards the same goal. Like, it's not about what you believe, it's about, you know, working to, like, change the conditions of, whatever, commodity production, social relations, power. And there are, like, I don't know, the practice of doing that can happen within like an institution, like a workplace, where you don't have to agree with your workers, but because you are all being exploited by the same boss or the same set of, you know, clients as a freelancer or something like that, then you have like a common interest in what you're doing, and you don't need to believe, and you don't have to be leftist or like, that doesn't have to be a party issue. It's been made that way, but that's because like mainstream politics is too far right, or whatever, too right-wing conservative parties. But just like, yeah, getting paid a better wage or having better working conditions, like it doesn't seem like it should have anything to do with your politics, what you believe in your party or whatever, or your spiritual practice or whatever. Like interfaith organizing is really interesting in that way. Like, Christians are usually pretty good about like, you know, poverty, even though they tend to be pretty bad about like abortion and women's rights. So interfaith organizing to like, yeah, deal with poverty between, like, as a Jew, between like Jews and Christians and Muslims and whatever. Like, it's not about changing anyone's belief or convincing them of anything at all. It's about the action.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep up and like apply, and I'm wondering, like, I'm only able to infer, I feel, a lot of what's being said, and I feel like is it as though it's like things that aren't like projects or like organizations that extend themselves beyond like esoteric work oriented behavior. Like, if you're not like closed, or you're not like, if you're esoteric, you're safe essentially, and if you're focused on just like the work and not necessarily talking about it, then that's also seen as like a good. And I'm wondering if I'm hearing this correctly, where it's like, once you're past just sort of like your own definitions, your group's definitions, and like supporting each other, like anything outside of that starts to get questionable, or like you start to wonder about its motivations, or like what is it doing with like language, or and I know I'm doing terrible things with like the thoughts here. I'm just like, is that approaching like kind of what's being said at all?
I think you've ended up in the right place, but like the background for that, I mean, yeah, you picked it up, but it's not just like a dogmatic thing. Like if you follow these rules,
No, I
it's
know.
good. If you don't, it's bad. It's like
No, I don't think that way. Just for what
through
it's worth, this is
looking at
all like,
history
yeah,
and whatever, looking at examples and extrapolating
yeah. It's like
the
groups that
rules
don't.
in general. And if you engage with something deeper, the rules don't apply anymore
Hmm.
because you have enough like other information to forget about these things that are like stereotypes that help you make quick judgments.
So like for instance, I guess like if you were to see Godmom as a closed system, I know that's a loaded term which I don't understand. So let's not say closed system. Let's say Godmom is esoteric. So let's say that there are no exoteric or public intentions with Godmom. Let's say that like this tech that we're looking at, or these discussions that we have, are really more about empowering ourselves as a group, and then doing the work because we enjoy it, and we want these tools for each other, and then we're going to support each other, and if people want to like join up, then that's cool, but if not, it's not like we're out trying to build a religion or whatever. Like if that were the vibe, does that does that get it within or without outside? Like does that bring it into more like does that bring it into the bounds of something that sounds more like non-fascist? Or like does that
Sure.
I don't even mean it that way. I just mean like within the definitions that you're using and your value system and such. I'm trying to like get a sense for, does that kind of change the color of it, or does that bring it
Yeah, but I
into
don't
the
think that could ever possibly exist because the
mm,
people who would be part of that also are part of the world outside of Godmom, unless they're like really strapped into the metaverse like the Matrix and they never leave. Like there's always this kind of cross contamination. Like this purely insular community is impossible, more or less today.
no, I know, but
Um,
like I don't think I don't get the impression that you have any issue, or like that you're worried at all about people forming groups. I get the impression that you're worried about people forming groups and then trying to proselytize for them, and like make universal truth claims and proselytize about those. Like that's when it starts to get shady. So in the case of Godmom, like is it okay to make some things? Is it like more okay for us to make things like universal truth claims about history or about God or what have you, as long as we're not worried about like evangelizing it, or as long as we're building these like this internal this tooling for like internal purposes that other people can or cannot use if they want to.
a really interesting question because I think what it implies is almost this idea of like, uh, if it's asking me like, Daniel, if you don't agree with us but we don't interact with you, is that okay? Or like,
Mm-hmm.
can we have our own little immoral community that won't affect you?
No, that's not.
And
Well, I hope that's not. I mean, even beyond the sounding personal, like that's not it at
no,
all.
I'm
I'm
not make
trying
it
to
personal to
listen.
me, but I mean something you could ask to
No,
literally
I know,
anyone.
but that's not even the case either. Because I'm trying. I
I
think.
think that is. Why is it not? I think that's a really interesting question. That's
Well,
why I framed it that way. It's like, uh, should our community be able to
yeah,
do things that are exploitative of ourselves or of each other, but we don't experience it that way?
yeah,
Um,
um,
like,
yeah.
what's
No,
the role
that's
of like self exploitation
that's
that
fair.
we're unaware of? And I think that's one of the core questions to understanding
Mm,
like capitalism today, where very often people don't realize that they're being exploited. You're supposed to like love what you do, um, you know, and you end up like enjoying your work, but that doesn't mean that like just because you might feel happy or something, there are all these other things that only show occasionally that can through analysis can be like demonstrated to be symptoms of these things that might on the surface seem like they're benign.
mm.
um, but when you, yeah, I don't know, look through more history or whatever, you can kind trying to show the way that like commodity exchange and capitalism are yeah, the way that like can cause depression today, for example, like Freud was talking about neurosis today, we could talk about depression as like this symptom of like social atomization under post-Fordism or something like that. Like, even though if you, I mean, I'm, yeah, I don't think I need to ramble into this, I guess. Like, that's straying further from your question. But the reason that I said that I framed it as like, if I had, is it okay for our little insular community to do our own immoral thing? My initial response was they're never like totally insular, they're never totally self-contained, and that's why it's important to engage in beyond just what one experiences as their own community, but to be in solidarity with people outside your community.
I mean, I think the trigger word there is immoral. Can you explain that?
Should I say, it's not important what I mean by immoral. I guess it's like you were asking me about whether it's something I approve of or I don't approve of. Would I find this more agreeable? That sounds like moral questions, but I'm not actually talking about.
Yeah.
I like morals. It's more like.
Well, I think, to be honest, like
the politics of it, actually.
Right. I mean, I think that's kind of when I protested at first. I think that I think that like the space that we're hinting at right now is what I kind of jumped in at, which is like what I was trying to do by making Godmom like esoteric and non-evangelical was to ask if it approximated your moral framework, which is the opposite of me asking like, if we made it immoral to you, would it then be okay? Like I guess that like I'm really trying to get at like the gas pedal and brake of like your morality when it comes to these kinds of systems, which is like I get the impression like, yeah, I mean I kind of already said it, but like if you don't try and proselytize and you also acknowledge that you are your own definition set and you don't try and like to the degree possible you keep that to yourself, then you are you are safe within my moral framework. Like that's kind of what I heard, and that's why I was asking like if we approximated it, like it sounds like we could. It's not because I know this is also just at a meta level. This is a very interesting and useful conversation for me because there is something very true and compelling and difficult about the fact that this, whether or not you agree that this stuff has been universal, you can agree that it's been universally esoteric, like it really has been guarded. It has been symbolic. It has been obfuscated purposefully. And we really are trying to undo that intentionally. And that's an ongoing, it's like, Jesus, are we really trying to do this? And then, yeah, so you're bringing up like a really interesting point of view on why that's maybe not a good idea and or like a way to do it that's still, like we could still do it, but maybe not be like so brazen about it or not be so.
And the way that you framed it as like, does this fit within my moral framework? Let me be clear. No, it doesn't. Like even if you make those changes, even if you're insular and non-proselytizing, was I clear about that?
Yeah, no private fascists.
Yeah, I mean, since I've been talking about psychoanalysis, like the thing that Marxists and psychoanalysis can show is that these things are structural. There is, like, Zizek says that, like, ideology is the mask itself. When you take off the mask, there's nothing behind it. It's written in the text of the mask. It's a structural illusion. So it's not, like, the process of uncovering knowledge is a process, and there's no object behind it. That like the thing that's uncovered is not a thing. It's a recognition of the circumstances that created the illusion of there being a thing.
It's like, you know, it's like Maya or whatever. Like, I maybe I'm probably almost certainly not getting the concept right, but um, yeah, I mean, I guess the question is like, it's sort of like, um, like for me, I would say that I want, you know, we're sort of impelled to say something, but to me, it has this sort of like, all who have ears to hear should hear, like allowing the light within people to recognize what's being. I mean, to me, it's sort of like the process of like um, the community of believers, like
Mm.
that it's we're trying to like we're trying to find those people. We already have some people, or like you know something is emerging, but in terms of the things that we produce, and then of course there's like the whole kind of like difficulty with production itself, um, and to kind of like relate that back to spiritual terms like doership, or you know like the way that um, Buddhists and Advaita people talk about like that it's not um, we're not doing anything, and the minute you start to do something is when the kind of like I don't know the let's say constructed self becomes involved, the self that is imposed on us from, I mean, I might even say like a sinful self, but that's kind of a complicated definition of sin. That I'm like not 100% confident about winding my way through yet. But yeah, basically that it's what like this sort of this idea of like blowing the lid off of something. Like I think, like it's kind of like to me like why my excitement is in community building, why it's like relational. Um, that it's more about like what are the things that are allowing us to build relations with people, and what are the things that are kind of like fertilizing our own like ability to relate and relating. And again, I think that's a Christ message. I think it's one about love. Like I think that's what's the for me the kind of like kernel. So it's like what is yeah, what is
Sorry.
what are we sort of like presenting here out of love to a community of believers. um, it's I guess like I mean, and to me in terms of like how it relates to esotericism, like to me the work we're doing here is not like the like blowing the lid off part has more to do with translation, and not translation necessarily for a wider audience or whatever, but for contemporary, like in the literal translation work that like Ben, like you and I have to do, or like anyone else on the fucking Discord about just like getting into the shit. Like we are sort of doing, at least I'm certainly like doing this process of like finding these things, working through the history, and like understanding how they are they are true in the ways that they are um, contemporary, like how they relate to the sum of history that is now or whatever, like the contemporary condition. And it's why I mean I think it's one of the things that lets me sort of like see between traditions, not in order to flatten, but in order to just like I don't know, like expose that self a little more, like that constructed self. Yeah, and I think it's I don't know, like I guess it's sort of like I almost want to have a less of a I don't know, like I want that like audience that like Paul had, which is like there's a group of people that have agreed to be together, and they came to that through a process that involved Paul talking to them on the street. In Jesus' case, like Jesus is just fucking talking on the street, and that's like okay, a particular ancient world like time and place. Um, but there's like that moment, and then there's also the moment of like we're here together now.
Um,
How are we like loving?
do you have a response, Ben? Because I'd be curious to hear it before I kind of have share my meta perspective on that.
I have things. I would love to hear what you had to say.
Okay, it's shifting the topic a little though. So if you want to, I don't know, engage with that, with what
Oh,
Catherine said.
um, no, I mean, Catherine, you know, you're. I find your. I feel embarrassed about my language around blowing the lid off of things. It was off
Oh
the.
no, I didn't mean to.
No, I don't.
Yeah,
I'm
I
not a. I'm.
you're very much in good. It's good faith, Ben. I think
No, I know.
it's just the work that we do together of like clarifying shit. That's all.
There's no problems here. I'm totally okay with being embarrassed and wrong. So when I say I'm embarrassed, I really just mean like I really like how I was going to build into like I really like how you translated into translation. Um, yeah, it's I mean this very much is for people who have ears to hear. We're trying to. I would say it's almost it's like there's people looking for a certain kind of food, and we're trying to like scattershot like breadcrumbs for them to like accelerate what they would have already wanted to engage in. Um, yeah, like digital native spirituality is our theme, is our thread. Like what does esotericism, I suppose, or like what does what you know what would Jesus do online? And I suppose to some degree that's what we're trying to recreate, and or I think I guess I'm the type that feels God evolves along with reality, I suppose, and or just that we're on an evolving course, not necessarily like towards progress, but some sort of change is involved, and I don't necessarily think that what was true or appropriate in the past is true or appropriate in the future. And I like the idea of potentially doing it differently. So maybe it is blowing the lid off of things, or maybe it's really more of trying to recreate what was in the past. But by virtue of the digital experience being what it is, which is a global flattening, like yeah, we're talking about like scaling esotericism significantly, even if we are trying to keep the same proportion of society esoteric, let's say.
Just by nature, like the scaling happens just by nature of a digital medium, or what?
Yeah, just by the fact that we're all operating on the same, well, basically the same internet and et cetera. I mean, Daniel, I'm sure this won't do anything. Actually, you have all kinds of. I'm sorry, I shouldn't speak for you. Let me describe this.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Let me describe this quality of the project, which is, as far as I understand it, one thing that could happen is that this, like this thread that we can help people get onto, which seems to be present in history. When I say history, you also have to. That also means time and geography. And by geography, the thing that excites me is that let's just say that there's truth here and that there is a pattern which can be established and recognized and taught. It's local. It's extremely localizable. It's highly localizable in the sense of some people will be able to see this and apply it to their own framework in a way that's useful and additive to them. And I think that that has to be true in order for it to be natively digital, because that's how digital shit works. It's like you can get software and you can bring it into your context, and it's generic, but it's also specific. It's like a Word document is not a spreadsheet. They have rules, but you can really freeform on top of it. And I think we're trying to approximate some sort of like spiritual template that seems to be present in the esoteric traditions throughout, et cetera, et cetera. And so I guess that's all of that comes to mind as we talk about this stuff, and that translation process.
Yeah, and like that's the thing that's interesting to me about Godmom as a project. Like I've been talking about uh, my practice, Catherine said, was like reading Marxist texts or something like that, or I've been talking about Marxism, which is part of my practice, but the that's the framework within which I'm able to branch out and comment on other things outside of the particular niche that I'm in, which is I'm researching new media culture and the value and aesthetics of like online
Nice.
media and like the economies and communities around that.
Awesome.
And spirituality is part of it. And I've been researching a lot around like internet, like the circulation of memes and the communities that form there and the values involved in those communities, and also in cryptocurrency and Web3 for the past, 4 years. The meme thing is more new. That's only been like 2 years or so. Yeah, and I think you're right to say today the way the majority of like successful and like viral internet movements work is through the way that you talked about it as like reaching people who are already saved or whatever, people who already know the big truth, and just kind of being a way for them to get together and amplify each other or something like that, rather than create any change. Really, it's more like a yeah. And
Well, I mean, sorry, I'm just thinking about like, well, what's the relationship between solidarity and virality? Like, what's the difference between
problematic for sure.
Yeah, and like, can you say, I don't know, like, can you say anything to that?
I mean, like when you look at the way, I think something that I've been like researching and writing about, I guess a bit, has been like the shift from like late night, from comedy being like a late night television thing, like something like SNL being like where you go to hear your like leftist, accessible, or not even leftist, but like more progressive or liberal political criticism, and now it happens maybe on like Twitter or Red Scare podcast or something like that, the Dirtbag Left, Chapo Trap House, and those, I mean, like there have been plenty of arguments made by leftists who I respect, saying that like the way that Chapo Trap House and Red Scare and the Dirtbag Left or whatever reach people through like just like accessible content, the creation of content, rather than like substantial engagement, just like going for clicks and views and working within this like-based economy, this like viral economy, is fascist. That's like, I forget their names of the researchers who have published on that, but
well, I guess then my follow-up question to it is like, is there any digital economy that's not viral, that doesn't depend on virality?
Yeah, there are.
And like, does that have a relationship to solidarity? Like, does that look like?
Like cryptocurrency in the early days, before the last, year and a half, or whenever it like really tanks in value and seems like it's never gonna come back, which I don't know if that's possible anytime soon. Like even if it tanks, I think people would think it's coming back because it's past a certain threshold now. But yeah, I mean the stuff that happens there is like not the interesting things that happen there are really focused on the types of change that they're trying to make. The big like ideological schemes and stuff are usually things that are more problematic in my view. I mean, like in the sense that not just problematic. There's nothing wrong with being problematic. They're more like exploitative and capitalist, I would say. Generally, the ones that are, yeah, like this whole cypherpunk thing about like individuals' value free from the state, except we need the state to guarantee our to like produce the circumstances under which we can choose to avoid them. And I mean, it's complicated. I can't think of one particular story off the top of my head right now to demonstrate that, I guess, in that context. But I mean, yeah, like some really niche subreddits have really thriving and helpful communities. Usually they're like really specific hobbies, like I don't know, a certain type of camping. I've been upset about the mechanical keyboard community recently, but I would say that there's still an example of like a niche community that's online that's doing something that's like interesting to them, and they don't really have like political ambitions, but they're, you know, whatever, they're spending money to do what they think is you know, a like DIY opposition to like industrialization and mass commodity production, which I mean, actually that is it's an interesting example to follow because what they're producing is still like this like more fragmentary capitalism, or like post-Fordist capitalism instead of, you know, modern industrial capitalism or whatever. It's like very specific boutique commodities that they sell in exchange rather than like mass media and mass markets.
I guess like to that, I'm like to think about us as like a niche, you know, like a subreddit or something like that. Like and like not having an explicit political aim. I think the tricky part for me is that I find the pursuit of spirit to be incredibly political in the way that it's required, like it's like a political love, like the relation required. That's like, it's sort of like kind of about this fundamental like you become just like the idea of like becoming a being in alignment to me seems, because it's interacting with structures like what I would call like sinful structures or something like that, but just like yeah, like or even again in Christian terms, like a fallen world or whatever. Yeah, that it's there's, to me, I just kind of don't think that there's a way to be that and still be in spiritual community. Like it requires a like if you're just on the like, I mean, because the other thing is that like these types of like niche spirituality online communities absolutely exist, you know, like a subreddit for some specific like Buddhist text or whatever. But the way it's
like
with
Politigram, yeah,
sure, like they're not churches, you know. Like one of the things that makes like I think what makes a church and what kind of what Christ is describing and what sort of, I don't know, yeah, whatever I feel about Christianity has to do with that.
Yeah, as a researcher, even though I'm interested in researching these niche communities, I'm interested in mainstream culture, or like culture at large, society at large, and I try to recognize the way that like a niche community and their particular values are always tied to and exist as like a certain bubble that is not outside of a more dominant hegemonic framework. And I think that's something that a lot of insular niche communities aren't as good at recognizing, or like part of dog fooding yourself into it or whatever is like losing sight of the context around you and starting to believe the whatever the thing that you're experimenting with or whatever.
Yeah, I think of that as like the sort of being in the world, but not like of the world. Like the way in which that's sort of a biblical directive. Like, like you're a believer, you have a community of believers, and then you're also interacting with shit outside of that. And then you have a certain prerogative as a follower of Christ to do that in a type of way. And that's one that's relational and has to do with love.
I guess I'm interested in Godmom as like a case study kind of in this, what I see to be actually a very widespread pattern of like a rejection of these certain of like modern notions of like secularism today,
Right.
and a shift towards like a different type of spirituality that's unrelated to either the past or the like the past before capitalism, before secularism, and also not really related to secularism either. It's like the religion of capitalism, the spirituality of late capitalism. I that's what makes me interested in things like astrology and all sorts of esoteric religions today, is the way that they're produced by this like generally late capitalist society, and maybe they're able to do something that's maybe subversive, but I wouldn't necessarily expect that, but I'm on the lookout for it, I guess. And
is that a statement of capitalism generating more capitalism, like that kind of like it's late capitalism isn't going to generate something outside of itself? Is that the?
No, I'm saying it may generate something outside itself, but
it's unlikely.
Don't see it yet.
Yeah.
Or sometimes I see it actually, but it's like it's not totally outside itself. It's like a bubble
Of course. How could
within capitalism.
No, I mean, yeah, I think Catherine already said too. Like, I think we're part of the task here is acknowledging our context and in large part trying to embrace it. Like, in as much as like from the micro of like being a missionary kid and wanting to atone to some degree, all the way up to like we are now in this moment where like our definitions are collapsing, and there's, like you say, there's this massive tide of spirituality mixed with like trad culture that's reacting in a really fascinating way. I'm jealous of your research focus. Happy to be a petri dish.
Yeah.
You feel free to our analytics and such if we ever have anything interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice just being kind of an interlocutor here and watching and participating too, because it's I mean, I'm not doing like, it's not anthropology, at least not really. It's more like media studies, cultural studies, or whatever. It's yeah. I mean, if I was going to be doing like social sciences research, I wouldn't be interacting like this, I don't think. I'd have to be more careful, but it's like research on culture.
Was it? If you guys don't mind backing up slightly, I guess I'm curious. What there towards the end, I feel like it was getting kind of into like a new space with Christian love, and what it does, like what that process looks like, and what the implications for community, and then the compatibility or lack thereof with what like Daniel's been teaching us, I guess. Like, like shorthand is Christ energy incompatible with like Marxist with like Marxism or
Oh,
something
it's
Yeah,
not.
like
yeah, I think that it's really the same. And I think or at least like that's sort of, well, I don't know, I'm sure Daniel's got another way to put it, but to me, when I like, there's kind of a flat way to look at it that's sort of like it's the same theme that we see in other places recurring again. But I also think that just has to do with wisdom, period. Like the concept of wisdom traditions. And so I see, um, I guess I just see Christ as really talking about the same thing. I see zero in my understanding of that, and also my reading of Christ, which, I would, has something to do with the way that spirit is working through me, the way that divinity works. Yeah, as being the same. Like I think the key for me is the um, relation. Like that's and love as being the nature of that relation, or like the almost the concept of relation to some extent, in the way in which God is love.
hmm. I guess I'd gotten into I had started to get the impression that there was something about the expressive quality or the behaviors that one starts to take as a default once they're going through this process that somehow transgressed or was contrary to the type of group formation behavior that was endorsed by Marxism. Um, but it sounds like that's not the case at all. Like
I don't
so
think so.
so then help me under so as so
I might think something else, but
I'm not quite following, to be honest.
well even I mean even just in terms of timeline, the Catherine had brought this up in reaction to what you'd been talking about, and so I'm just kind of putting them together and wondering and trying to understand the relationship between the two. And I think just like tone of voice and such, it seems slightly like not a challenge, but like a point of difficulty between the two. But it sounds like I misinterpreted, and very interesting. So is it sort of like could you say that maybe like you guys were very unanimous in your reaction to there being like a separation between the two. So it sounds like there's actually quite a bit of
Yeah.
there's actually quite a bit of parallelism, which is cool. And so would you say maybe that like Marxism could be thought of as like I'm sorry, I'm obviously very clumsy, but like Christ energy applied to social organization or like group formation. It's like
I don't know. You would need to explain what you mean by Christ energy and group formation and that sort of thing. Like, uh, something I was just thinking about the past, portion of our conversation is the way that a lot of like structuralist and post-structuralist work in the 20th century was done to show how, like, first how like secularism is rational and modern, and then to show how non-secular religions are also like rational and modern and logical. Um, like first, like this was kind of a historical thing, like first demonstrating like uh, following the long history of like humanism, showing how like rationality and science are values to endorse, and then a more inclusive, like post-structuralist follow-up to say these things that seems like they were excluded from our rationality actually follow these same patterns if you think symbolically, I guess, right? Or, yeah, I mean, yeah, kind of like reinterpreting, um, like yeah, thinking of like Deleuze's like logic of sense and that sort of thing. And what's interesting to me about as some like maybe postmodern or whatever, this like new spirituality thing that I see a lot of new age type um, or esoteric religions or groups or beliefs or whatever following is uh, something that doesn't seem like it is interested in like interrogation beyond the surface of things, like the yeah, this like surface level engagement as kind of whereas in the past like maybe something like critique and like looking deeper in the text and pulling out citations and looking for connections through like I shouldn't have said looking for a connection, just like a certain type of analysis that's based on depth. And yeah, I mean, this is like what Frederick Jameson says about postmodernism. It's this like surface thing, the aesthetic surface.
I'm really thinking about the Sophie piece, which I'm not sure that we can get into, but it just in a way, like basically there's this essay that this girl on TikTok wrote, but actually she's really good. She's like in a PhD program or something, about the music of Sophie, and I don't know, like the way that it was working with like the music industry and capital and stuff was very like whatever critical theory, post-structural analysis stuff about it. But basically just like the way in which that work was sort of like using the machine. It seemed like there was a way in which that work in its being inside of like post capital and like interacting with this industry, this like music industry was also still sort of like creating something more than the sum of its parts, and that it wasn't entirely free because like the aesthetics of it kind of kept getting reabsorbed into mainstream music, but it still also could like I think what interests me there specifically and why I just can't as usual can't stop thinking about Sophie is like just the way in which it's the machine is an important component. I think that's kind of one of the things that we are dealing with here is like thinking about what it means to be digitally mediated. Like it's gonna show up in every sphere of culture, but I'm curious. Like to me, that's just also just one of the things that makes is asking us to do translation. Like the way that the thing is mediated in the ancient world is really different than the way that us in our sort of like post-organized religion or in the wake of those institutions as those institutions are kind of falling apart. What we're doing now.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't finish reading that Sophie piece, but I think the ending that I would like to see might be some sort of recognition of like the limits at this point in history on that type of music, the way that it would take a complete revolution of society to make that like some sort of like I mean, it's compelling now because of the way that it's contradictory and like problematic, and to say like, oh, it's just good music, there's nothing wrong with it, misses the point. And for it to have that like, oh, it's just good music, whatever reaction, I think would take a complete revolution of society, under which like the way that she's describing that these aesthetics are continuously absorbed and resold to the communities that produce them or something like that. Like it's just pretending they don't exist doesn't make it like like good art. Like the thing that makes it good is the way that it's like an anti-aesthetic.
And it's an anti-aesthetic
And so
because
so
it's
it's
like a
so it's good as a work of art, and it's not good as a politics, not good as a spirituality, not good as an ethics, but good as art because it illuminates these tensions.
yeah. I mean, I think like in Christian terms, the to me that sort of like revolution in society is analogous to the second coming, basically. That's sort of like this kind of why the concept of fallen world is used, like why it's an idea in that theology. Just like something to kind of describe the sort of unfinished nature of the work at every point, and this sort of like while there is access to perfection or like divinity, like divine perfection, like in the present, there's also the mediated, like there's the human piece or the kind of material piece that's always keeping something imperfect or the kind of incompleteness, the way in which it's a spiral and not a circle.
The apocalypse, the second coming, as the yeah, I mean, revolution in society, but I would say revolution in society as symbolic of the revolution within the individual. It's one
Well,
of
that's
my
what a revolution
Yeah.
society would be.
Yeah.
Like that's what it would have to be. Is every all of those individual lights recognizing themselves as the light. Like the, I
well,
mean,
yeah, but yes,
That's so
I
cool to say that it takes self-recognition. I think
No,
it needs to be forced on people.
oh, okay, that's spicy. I mean, I guess I mean self-recognition in the sense of like illumination or enlightenment. Like the like I don't know. Like there's no ways in order to do that without having it be relational and external as well.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. Like it's not like cool, just like, take some, be alone with yourself. That's like not what the texts are suggesting at all.
Yeah.
They make a point of it being relational.
Do you not consider something like a Saturn return or a spiritual breakdown in the vein of does that not get spiritual apocalypse?
No.
Yeah.
It has to be
Like a
collective.
spiritual apocalypse is a real apocalypse. It's like a
Yeah.
real change. It's not just consciousness.
Yeah, but
Like
the thing is, all of this stuff is hermetic or like fractal, and I think we actually agree in as much as like the only way to get to the universal apocalypse is through the individual apocalypse.
I disagree. I think like after the certain failures of the the way that there hasn't been a good leftist revolution in the and there have been many failed attempts or aspirations to that, has prompted a lot of thinkers to ask like, what's this revolution going to be like? A lot of post-structuralists like Marxians say that it's an impossible thing. Like there is no, I mean, this is something that people disagree on actually, but like this is like the whole discussion of like the event or whatever. The one that's most compelling to me at this point, although I'm not going to say I'm like fully sure that this is correct or whatever, but just as an alternative to what you're saying, I guess I think it's worth entertaining this idea that like maybe the revolution will happen without anyone knowing. That it, like that's another way that it could happen is just through gradual subtle changes that people aren't aware of day to day, but when you look at it in context of history, everything has changed, but there was never like a moment of revolution. It's something that you don't experience, but rather it's like brought to society through a series of gradual, subtle, and unconscious changes.
Not much of an apocalypse.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
Word,
Yeah, I mean, I
word,
think you know, like what
this-
makes an apocalypse is being like a total change. But I also think that, yeah, I don't know. I like this reading of Apocalypse as well.
That's a very Jewish reading of it, actually.
Well, that's why I'm interested
Rather
in
than the
Judaism.
Christian one of saying
Yeah.
that it already happened and we're living in the apocalypse, right?
Well, there's two readings. That's one of them. The other one is that it hasn't come. You know, just like the kind of, it's almost like the Marxist one. You know, like it's this.
And it'll never come.
That's, and then of that group, there would be two. I mean, I think most Christian
And it's important
theologians
to believe in it because it will never come, not in spite of that, because.
I mean, there's definitely a branch of Christianity that would be in that sect. There would be other Christians that would call that very heretical or cynical.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's something about being in the world as though it is like, that's kind of this idea of like imminent apocalypse, like the imminent apocalypse that's never happened, like never gonna happen, or sort of like, I don't know, like that just this kind of like be on your toes because like because Jesus could return at any moment. And I see that as being like I don't know, like it is to me that's the reading that sort of aligns most, is this idea of like you're acting in a type of way, you're bringing it you're like bringing it into being through like pointing yourself that way.
No, I was gonna, when you started describing it, I was gonna say that sounds kind of silly to me.
I mean, I guess it's like through spirit too. Like that's the thing, is the kind of like
the idea,
presentness.
I mean, what you were saying about be on your toes because it could happen at any moment is not what I'm saying.
No, but it's I'm parroting a kind of both what's sort of like, yeah, what's said in the Bible and also what is often messaged in Christianity.
Isn't this? But aren't these like? I mean, this is esotericism, which is the taking of the outward and applying it inward. You take languages and words and phrases about, you know, like directions and like the parables and such, and they're, you know, they're seemingly about what's happening outside, and then you apply them towards inner wisdom, and you use the language symbolically, and it turns out they're talking about something that's not quite exactly what you thought they were talking about. And that's the case with like the holy marriage. And I think it's the case with the apocalypse, where yes, it does mean exterior and it also means interior. And I don't wonder if like the kingdom of heaven is within you is a statement, is an esoteric statement. And it's the kind of statement that makes something like the return of Christ. Wow, it's really loud, sorry. But it's the kind of statement that makes something like the return of Christ and the apocalypse and salvation all imminent at all times. Like the apocalypse is immediately available in as much as Christ's love and surrender is immediately available. And these are processes that are, as far as I understand it, these are words for archetypal processes that everything goes through, and that includes your interior self and society itself. So I guess I'm just contributing my understanding of this. Like you both sound right to me, where it's like it's both internal and it's going to be a societal thing. And that's what I was trying to get at when I was saying it's both. And also, I didn't, just for what it's worth, I didn't mean to be dismissive or ignorant on like the that doesn't sound like an apocalypse thing. It's kind of a wordplay. Like the term itself seems to imply like a, you know, we've culturally associated it with like hell and brimstone, but I really like the idea of it being like, you know, the slow boil, and then, you know, from the perspective of eons of time, the change from over centuries from something to what you're describing as apocalypse would be, you know, momentary, would be instant. So like a slow boil for us humans is small potatoes on the timeline. So yeah, I find that very compelling. It's interesting though. I don't know if it kind of like, I don't know if I've ever heard like a slow evolution towards good. Like I hear it in terms of like the singularity or in terms of like paranoia, um, but I don't know if I've heard natural. Well, I guess I mean I guess it's like a Teilhard concept. That's like teleology itself, isn't it? Like the purpose we're moving towards. I think, as far as I understand it, like I
Yeah,
don't know if I've ever heard of like a negative.
like Hegelian Marxists or anti-Hegelian Marxists get it is by
Mm,
totally twisting and subverting the way that um, like Hegelian dialectics and teleology, and
mm.
making it something that undoes itself.
Oh.
Like the impossibility of it is like the twist to say it's not a typical teleology. It's
Mm,
not actually going to happen.
mm,
It's an illusion that is structural and cannot be escaped. Um, and like you can't ever recognize it. It's not something that any amount of because it's a structural thing. You can't get past it.
mm,
I mean, I think it's to me. I think it's um, analogous to enlightenment or certain concepts of enlightenment, where it's just like it's um, well, I mean, even thinking about that as just being like in God's hands, just like how spirit moves, like whether or not you become enlightened has nothing to do. But then there's a sort of like the nature of I don't know the nature of spirit moving. But even just like I don't know, I think about these sort of like classic like Buddhist concepts of enlightenment that are like you never strive, um, you 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 basically have to believe that you will not become enlightened. Or like that's what you have to do with your mind because it has a lot to do with like um, working with the mind. It's the sort of like techniques of the mind.
I mean, for me, the unconscious is much more interesting than consciousness. I feel like
Well, it's about yeah. I mean, it's like the Buddhist thing's like it's like a working with consciousness towards the unconscious.
that's not what I mean, my gut reaction, I haven't seen any. I mean, I haven't found the right text that like fully interrogates this, but what I gather from seeing pieces of it in other texts is like because the unconscious as like this non-personal generic thing that everyone has the same like everyone's unconscious is the same. It's like the world that we're unaware of that's material and there or whatever, um, and that being the both the symptom and the it's both the structure superstructure and the base for the superstructure. It's like a symptom and the feedback loop in it. It's a symptom in a feedback loop that's causing itself. It's a self-moving substance or whatever of history. Um, the that like interest in the unconscious, which is like the part of oneself that's outside oneself, that everyone has together, means that you don't need to worry at all about what you think, and that doesn't mean like you can't think you're enlightened. It's not a command or an ethics. It's like a impossible thing. You cannot experience your own enlightenment because you're separated from it. It can never happen.
Well, you can never as soon as you become enlightened, you're not you. That's why
Yeah.
you can't experience it, which I think is in keeping with what I'm describing in Buddhism.
Yeah, it's not this like, I guess like almost like Puritan like, or I guess you said it was like some sort of Buddhist or whatever thing, like this like you cannot, you shouldn't think that you're enlightened. You need to work through your consciousness. You need to make sure that your consciousness is not getting too prideful or whatever.
I mean, there's some of that, and that's also just my own whatever. Yeah, there's a Calvinist layer there that's pretty heavy that I'm not gonna be able to get away from necessarily. But it's more like I think that this I think my impression is that Buddhism is describing this self that like that cannot, by nature of being the self, cannot experience enlightenment. It cannot be, you're not you when you're enlightened. Like, okay.
Yeah,
And that's kind of I relate that to
it's
apocalypse.
a complete transformation of the subject. Yeah.
Right. And that's that's kind of what I relate to apocalypse. That's kind of what I relate to the kingdom of heaven as well.
I like, I think it's Ray Brassier says that consciousness begins after death. Like you're always unconscious, and yeah, until you die, until you're not you anymore.
Yeah. But it's like all that being, it's like, okay, that information is there and available. We interact with it through selfhood, through an ego. It's like, what does that do for how we act and move?
It's not our decision, right?
Well, yeah, at the end of the day, it's like, well, that's the thing, is like spirit moves us. Like, it's not us, it's God. And also there's this, we get to experience, God, everything's in God's hands, and we also have this experience of decision making. We have this experience of free will.
Yeah.
As a part of being a self, as a part of having a self, as part of having an ego. There's a sense that we are moving through the world and doing things, even though it's all in God's hands.
Or maybe it's all in God's hands, but God is everything, and the experience of free will is not just, or like, there's a certain understanding of free will that isn't like, you can recognize the falseness in it, and like I would say, like, it's not just an illusion to say, like, stop believing it, it's an illusion. Like
Yeah.
the like, you have to believe it because it's an illusion.
Mhm.
Daniel, is there I feel like we talked about archetypes at the beginning, but I'm curious, are there in your research or your interests, if I understood correctly, it's very much in the unconscious or the subconscious, and do you deal, or do you follow up, or like, are you down with archetypes, or like, where do they?
I don't really know what they mean. I get that they come from, like, Jung, and I don't like Jung. Not that I've ever engaged with them substantially, but I know that the reason Freud chose Jung to be his, like, disciple or whatever, his to carry on the tradition of psychoanalysis and the study of the unconscious, is because he saw that like, the rise of anti-Semitism, and that psychoanalysis was being associated as a Jewish science, and he recognized that, like, the study of the unconscious is really important, and so he chose a Nazi to carry on his practice beyond, like, after he died. And so there are other like, lineages that follow up on Freud's work that are not Jungian that I find much more compelling. And yeah, the texts I read, like, rarely ever engage with Jung, so I don't see him referenced in almost anything I read, so I don't read him.
Are there, the equivalent of an archetype would be something like universal and identifiable, nameable patterns in our unconscious that are not isolated from each other.
Oh yeah, I think we call that, like, fascism, or the authoritarian personality, like Adorno talks. Yeah, it's Adorno. Talks about that as, like, a stereotyping, and he was doing this, like, he came up with, like, a quiz, like, that you answer through I mean, yeah, you can Google it, I guess. I haven't ever actually done it. But that's kind of it asks useful questions, actually, but isn't, yeah, yeah, my understanding is that that type of thinking is, the way they talk about it in the authoritarian personality is in relation to, like, a certain like pathological form of the Oedipus complex. Like they talk a lot about like the being simultaneously um, enamored with and afraid of the power of some authoritarian figure. Um, yeah, I don't remember the specifics of like what I mean. Yeah, a lot of the theoretical texts that I engage with don't talk about like stereotypes in that way. The more like contemporary work engages with like racism as a structural thing and not as something that happens in consciousness, because those Jungian ideas are really esoteric and not so relevant in most of society today. But that type of thing used to be more prevalent, I guess, and we kind of call it stereotyping today.
And stereotyping, yeah. So the belief and the behavior that I guess the behavior isn't necessarily part of it, but because you didn't say it, but the belief that there are underlying patterns in the unconscious that are shared, and non isolated from each other, is a
eugenics, I guess. Yeah.
is a description of an authoritarian belief system or mindset or personality. I'm sorry, I don't know the right term to append
The book
to
is
it.
called The Authoritarian Personality. It's really long. You can probably pull it up. I mean, I downloaded an ebook. I think like Verso re-released it maybe or something like that. And Control F and find something interesting to you.
And then there was another thing to bring it around to, which was just like there was like a applied term for it, I guess. So I guess like any system then that's built on top of that, the set of assumptions is an authoritarian system, or is a system with an authoritarian personality.
Well, that's the way that this text talks about it. But it, like,
very interesting.
Yeah, this idea of archetypes, like, I don't think is very.
Oh, and then yeah, so that's
Right.
that's right. You brought it, yeah, and then you said archetypes now would just be called stereotyping.
Yeah, so, which is to say, like, the anti-racist work today or whatever, isn't so interested in stereotypes and is much more interested in like structural racism, which is why I haven't encountered so much about like archetypes. Is because they're, yeah, just like not that type of thinking isn't very modern or postmodern or whatever.
I'm not getting the association between archetypes and racism. I mean, there could be an archetype of racism, but also like archetypes are like I know you're into astrology, so like an archetype would be like, you know, Martian energy or Venusian energy. You know, like archetypes are, you know, incredibly important to astrological systems as far as I understand it.
I mean, I think that's part of why Daniel's interested in astrology, is because he's like, what the fuck is it?
Yeah, I'm interested in astrology because I I see it as a really problematic practice, as something that's generally pretty like discriminatory in the belief system that it follows. But in practice, there's a lot of like, you know, queer leftists that think it's a good thing. So I guess it's more like, yeah, really, I guess it's not as tied to like, I mean, no, there are lots of ties showing how it's related to fascism, like, you know, literal Nazi esoteric
right
history. But it's also like part of this. I'm not saying all identity politics is bad, but there's a particular practice of identity politics on the left that yeah, has more in common with fascism than other, non-identitarian leftist movements that focus more on class or whatever. Um,
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah.
like that's the interesting thing to me, the way that it's. Um,
Is stereotyping itself an authoritarian trait? Is that part of what's why this is?
in the authoritarian personality in that text, I think it is.
Yeah.
But I would also just say this sort of, um, I mean, yeah, in like the modern and postmodern or whatever era, like this presupposition of some sort of like innate pattern or whatever is kind of out of place.
It's very
I guess,
masculine.
It is esoteric.
yeah, I mean, I guess it's what I'm curious about is like, and what I think is like relevant to your work as well is the um, relationship between archetypes, myth making, narratives, and language. Um, like I don't disagree that there's like a specific Jungian thing that is archetypes, but to me that's where I'm unclear. Like that's what I don't know.
Interesting to think of astrology as like, really elaborate stereotyping, and then.
I mean, I actually I think that's like a pretty like that's how I see it used a lot.
Yeah, 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 for
And I think
sure.
it's also very hard to, and I think I just don't know actually if it's possible to use it without that.
Mm-hmm.
Or like one of the things I'm curious about is like if astrology isn't really a belief system on its own, what makes it, how can it be paired with a belief system? What does the belief system do that gives it that might allow it to operate without stereotyping?
I wonder too if just like as it rose in dominance as a system of organization, societal organization, kingships, that kind of thing, timing your crops, not your crops necessarily.
Exactly. Right.
I don't.
Exactly.
I wonder how much of that wound up, by virtue of it being that type of behavior, wound up detracting from what may have been more balanced or like priestess-based societies.
I mean, I guess I see like David was just like, well, you do it, it stops being about the individual, and I guess it's like that part makes sense to me. Also makes sense to me from like a history of astrology perspective, where it's like the like natal astrology is an invention, and it's not, it has it before that it's this calendar situation, and like timing for groups. But also like I think it's just like in the nature of postmodernity, it's of course going to be individual and hyper individual, and so it's, to me, it's this sort of like the way in which all postmodern things are dealing with that to some extent.
I was just in you asking that question, like what would make it not stereotyping, or what's the role of like separating people from it? That made me think like, well, there is something that totally separates like humanity or humans from the cycles of celestial bodies, and that's astronomy today. But that's not as interesting to me as the human part of it, the social part of it.
Well,
And I was
it can be
thinking of
social without being individual, right?
yeah, exactly. Like what I was thinking about in geography, there's like human geography is part of geography. Like what is like human astronomy?
But that would be astrology.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be the way that most people practice astrology.
Not the way that most
like
people
I think,
practice astrology, not the way that it's in the discourse.
yeah, I mean,
but,
like as
yeah.
like a non-individual, like non-personal study of the relationship between people's beliefs about, you know, celestial bodies or whatever and each other. Human astronomy.
Well, I don't know. I like non-personal astrology or depersonal astrology.
Yeah.
We have been talking for a very long time. We did good.
Yeah.
I'm wiped.
Me too.
Yeah.
We need to eat food.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good call. Eat some food, get some work done. This was like super duper interesting and helpful and useful and appreciated. Thank you, Daniel, especially for all the hard questions and interesting points.
Get that. I'm interested in like this Godmom project, especially because I've been with Catherine and on my own too, like researching the relationship between like between spirituality and cryptocurrencies, or like the crypto part of, or just this like online internet community that's trying to sell something, I guess. Whether that's or just like distribute commodities or whatever is really interesting to me. More so than these discussions of symbols in this sense, like the value of symbols, I guess.
Yeah, but that's what we get from you. You have to pay the piper.
Yep, that's what I did today.
If you wanna watch, you can watch, but you know.
And
first
you gotta give a little.
Yeah.
First hits free.
I'm glad I did it today, but if this is what every meeting with you guys would be like, I'm not gonna come to any more. I don't think I would come to some more, but I'd rather tune in for the ones that avoid the stuff on this spreadsheet, or at least trying to like work through those questions. Like, it's not something that I'm so interested in being a part of. I'm interested in like engaging with you, Ben, and the like I appreciate the way that you're trying to like, that you think this will actually help people, and you're trying to like work through the you know, points of confusion that come up and trying to like improve it. But to me, I see it as such a deeply flawed approach that I'm more interested not in what you're doing specifically with the content there, but just like how you're using it, how you're you know, presenting it to people, or what you think people are gonna get out of it, rather than the content of the thing.
Word. Well, like I said earlier, I'm happy to be a petri dish for your studies, and yeah, like I said, I found your feedback really useful, and as you know, as people interested in doing as the least harm possible, like keeping us honest as much as we're able to, while still, I mean, I appreciate your honesty. I don't doubt that we're deeply flawed.
I wouldn't want to stop you from doing it either. Like, I don't think I would be able to stop you, but I don't want to either. Like, I'm happy that you're going forwards with this, as long as you don't get too big and start actually hurting people or whatever. But I don't think that'll happen.
You can take Catherine out when it does.
Yeah.
That'll hovel us forever. We'll never recover.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think you guys are going to a showing or something, huh? I'm jealous.
I don't know. At this point, I think it might be too late.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
It's okay. I was engaged. I was into it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I hope the night treats you well either way.
Yeah.
You too.
Talk to you soon, Ben.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for watching. We got a good handful of watchers. It was nice. Kind of
Well,
ignore
I
the.
can't see the. Yeah, we don't have the stream open, so I don't know if there were any.
Yeah, no, Tracker talked a bunch. I'm sorry, man. I was ignoring it. I was trying to listen. This is like listening to you two speak was like an exercise for sure. It was like ears wide open. It's funny because there's so little I understand that it's largely like it's like it's like trusting the impressions that you're getting. It's like I'm hearing things, I don't understand any of it, but I am getting an impression. And does that impression seem true to the degree that I can explain it? And then just sort of going from there. But that's hard work. It's like, yeah. Anyway, all right, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, you're good at doing that. And
Okay.
you did a good job with it.
All right, thank you. All right. I'll see you guys online.
Peace. Bye, Ben.